Hey guys, it's Jared here for Chart Tech. Today we're going to be taking a look at if FX processors are still viable processors to get in 2018.
This video brought to you by Self-Destructive Behavior Club. Check out their merch store at reptheroses.com.
So, the FX processor launched in 2011, with the most notable among them being the 6000 and 8000 series chips, with 6 and 8 cores respectively. This was equal or higher in core count to Intel's mainstream i7-980 at 6 cores. Combined with the fact that the top of the line 8120 was a third that the cost of the i7-980, AMD had some intriguing CPUs on their hand. With the Ryzen architecture being the mainstream architecture of AMD today, does it even make sense to go back to the last architecture of the FX processors and buy them at the low-end price point? At the time of filming, an FX 8350 can be bought off of Newegg for $80, and it just so happens I have one. And it's essentially a steal of a price, being about half that of what I paid a few years back. The processor is still chugging along in my secondary system, and it still gets plenty of use. It's used pretty much every day. With Ryzen appealing to me for an upgrade in my secondary system, I wanted to see just how out of date the FX 8350 really is. So I don't have a lot of processors to test, but I do have 5 CPUs I can use for testing. I have the FX 8350, that's our main CPU of testing. The i5 6500, which is what I upgraded to after the 8350. I have an i7-7700K, that was the last generation high-end i7 processor. I have the Ryzen 7 1800X, which is the last generation high-end AMD processor. And I have an i7 6500U mobile processor, which is a few generations old, but still newer than the FX 8350. So what those 4 CPUs have in common is they are all newer processors by a couple of years at least. So today we'll be using Firestrike's physics score, which is solely dependent on CPU, Cinebench R15, the CPU test, and user benchmark for our test, and we'll be looking at our single, multi-threaded, and quad-core performance. In Cinebench R15, the FX 8350 scored 611, which put it right in the middle of our charts for speed, placing it higher than the mobile i7 chip and the i5 6500, meaning in raw CPU performance, it can still hold with modern chips, at least according to our Cinebench test. In the Firestrike physics test, we see the FX 8350 standing right in the middle of the charts again, albeit holding on to third place by a small 2% over the i5 6500. In user benchmark, we're going to be collecting data from our single core, quad core, and multi-core performance. On the single core performance, the FX 8350 falls dead last, roughly 14% slower than that of the i7 6500 mobile CPU. AMD processors are not known for having fast single core performance. The Ryzen 7 1800X even fell short to the i7 7700K by about 14%. Although single core performance does tell you how well a CPU may perform in games, as long as the game does not depend on more than 2 cores, the FX processor is going to fall short of the Intel counterparts. On the quad-core side of thing, the FX 8350 comes in second to last, just 5% above that of the i7 6500U, which is, again, the dual-core hyper-threaded CPU. I will note, though, in games that require more than 2 cores, you will be better off with the FX chip, as playing games like Battlefield do not play nice with dual-core CPU, so your Pentiums are low in i3 or your Celeron. More in that price point, it's going to be your Pentium and your Celeron processors. The i7 6500U severely bottlenecks you in game. Let me just say that, like Battlefield 1, you can't even run it like 800 by 600 on low at 30 FPS stable. In the multi-core test, the FX 8350 falls back into its third place rut, but it's just barely ahead of the i5 6500 and trailing the i7 7700K by a large margin, which makes sense, as it is a much newer much higher end CPU. So overall, when combining all the scores, the FX processor lands in third place ahead of the i5 6500 that I used to upgrade from it, and falling short by 18% to the i7 700K and just 1% above the i5. So I was getting ready to give the FX 8350 my recommendation until I remembered, what is the board and RAM availability like? Well, AM3 boards aren't that great on availability anymore or quality, not that they ever were in the first place. I have a fairly recent one. It's actually on like the first gen BIOS that was published last year, and it's not the greatest. It can't stay stable at 4.4 gigahertz on the CPU, which I could do on the MSI board pretty easily that I had before it that died. That's, you know, pretty typical of the MSI board. And the only way I can actually get it stable at the 4.4 gigahertz, which is what you were seeing in all the tests, is saying to turbo up to 4.4 gigahertz if it can, but it always does. Also, expansion on it isn't great. There's one PCIe X16 slot, and that's really about it. And the AM3 Plus board is severely lacking. Not that it was great in the first place, though, as I mentioned. The RAM market for DDR3 is shrinking. While you can still find decent RAM, you're stuck on a last generation DDR. Not to mention the upgrade path to the CPU is not going to be viable at all. For $80, yeah, it's a good CPU. But if you're going to be using it for gaming or anything that you don't need just raw CPU performance for, spend the extra $20 on a Ryzen 3 or an i3. But if you need a cheap video/photo editing CPU where the more cores are going to make sense, go with the FX processor. Well, thank you for joining me in this video. If you liked it, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and be sure to click that subscribe button. And I'll see you guys in the next video.